in his mind it was ending up in the red corner, which was unimportant and urgent, and that would always get a very annoyed response. It was good that he showed me this, because it helped me to think about what are the important urgent things for me, and also what are the important not so urgent things for me. And in Stephen's mind, usually the yellow corner was the most interesting to work in. And this has been a good reference over the last 2 years. What is important for me are two things. One, cities, as you see it here, and two, people. And where they come together, which is in space, of course. This is a beautiful diagram that I didn't want to keep out of this presentation. Some of you may recognize it. It's a diagram made by Georges Perec in the 70s for his book Species of Space, or his text Species of Space. Was a text of 1974, and you see here that space is always in the center of the conversation, and that's also how we would like to shape the program at the museum. To go back to that museum, in relation to cities, in relation to people, this is again a few years before the opening. You see Frank Lloyd Wright standing here with a hat in his hands. Next to him, Hilla Ribe, she was the curator of the Guggenheim Foundation. And next to her is Solomon R. Guggenheim. They look at a model, and this was at a time when people had no clue what to make out of this building, because you must imagine, for the people that have not been to Fifth Avenue in New York, especially at that point, there were still townhouses standing right next to our building. So it was such an odd building to live with suddenly. People had no clue what to make out of it. They called it a washing machine or the hot cross bun. And Ada Louise Huxtable, who was writing about the building in 1959, she's still an architecture critic and very well respected. She used to work for the New York Times at that point, must have been a super young writer, and slightly worried about what you're going to say if this is one of the first buildings that you're reviewing. So what she titled her review was Right with a W or Wrong, because she had no clue what to make out of this building. And what Wright had said in the years leading up to the opening is that you could also see the building as a continuation of the New York Street grid, a one-story building that is just circling up along, or is spiraling up along Fifth Avenue. And I think that's still a good reference for us to play with, especially as we start to see our architecture exhibitions, much less as monographic shows, but more so as projects that deal with cities and deal with people. Urban analysis is usually something like this, or at least in the last 10, 15 years. And although this is probably one of the most important statements that has been made and very helpful to make us see how urgent the situation is, 50% of the people living in cities today and 75% in 2050, I must say I'm getting slightly tired of all of the data, however beautifully it's sometimes presented. This is a book that I would encourage all of you to read if you haven't seen it yet. It's actually a few years old. It's the Metropolitan World Atlas by Joost Grotens, a Dutch designer, which is mapping information very, very beautifully. The other thing that we saw in urban analysis over the last decade was a series of books that all had essays in them that were very much questioning. You can see that the writers are not entirely convinced where we're going to, what is the urban condition, what is it about, and so on. The strange thing is, even though those texts are questioning, and rightfully so, the way that those books are illustrated gives you a totally different sense of reality. Or actually of truth. They're illustrated with these photos that give the suggestion everything is under control, we know exactly what is going on, which I don't think is the case. I have two photos here. I should mention the names of the photographers. Frank van der Zalm is the first one here, makes great photos. In this case, it looks like it's a model, but it is actually a real situation. And the second one that you also find often in books like this is Edwin Zwakman, also a Dutch photographer, and in this case he is shooting situations that look absolutely real, but that are models. And I wanted to use this photo to loop us on to the next introduction. or actually the introduction after this one. I want to take a brief pause here, because as you have that urban analysis going on, and we're trying to figure out what our programs are about, I think this may actually be a better reference than much of what you see in architecture. Probably many of you don't know who this is. I didn't until a few weeks ago. This is Jules Nader, a young kid, 7 years old, or at least when this photo was taken in 2008. He was the youngest person on Earth to experience microgravity, and I think that's an interesting topic to work on in the curatorial field. What does it mean if you create a situation of weightlessness? Well, he found out, and to explain you what microgravity is, it's a situation of almost weightlessness, so there's still a little bit of gravity happening. And what happens in how they test this, or how they create these situations, is in these planes, which they call the vomit comets. So you start to throw up in them. And they fly around in these large loops, going up in this arc that you see in the back of the image. And when they go down, they create this 25 seconds of weightlessness. And when they pull out, then actually the gravity is getting twice as strong. So it's a really strange situation that you're in for a moment. I think Jules quite enjoyed it, as you can see here. It's well, I think a sweet example of what weightlessness can mean. A lot of enthusiasm. Which brings me to the next topic, and we're going back in the next few examples between opposites. So on the one side, for instance, good and bad, but in between that, there are different zones, and I'm very interested in that in-between zone, the zone of almost weightlessness. In this case, we'll start with Goed Wonen. This is a magazine cover of 1948. I was actually surprised when I saw that, because it's quite, well, I think it's great design, and you could see this happening today, basically. Goed Wonen means good living, as you probably guessed. And this was a foundation and magazine that was advocating, after the Second World War, what living should be about. It was all about fresh air, light, in juxtaposition to what you see here on the left, the situation where everything was closed, dark. They were going to a situation where people were living in towers, and you know this story, that were considered as much more pleasant and much more effective for society. You all know this example in Marseille, in this case shot by Andreas Gursky in the 90s. And I wanted to have this photo in here because the reference that I'm going to make was also shot by Gursky, and I thought it was kind of strange. We're making a jump of 50 years, or a little under 50, or over 50 years actually, to 2005, and you probably remember the situation when in Paris, in the suburbs, all of these riots started, and it took a few months actually. They started in October and lasted for a while. The suburbs where you have these big towers in the green were not as pleasant as was thought in the 50s. There's a high unemployment rate, a lot of immigrants that are not leading the lives as they would like them to lead. And so there's a lot of people that are frustrated, which was vented through through the vandalism on these cars. Although there was a lot of bad press around this time, the situation was interesting, because what happened is that Libération, one of the key French publications, picked up a story that was not about all of these scary issues, not about the riots, but about the opposite, a positive story. And this was being picked up by Zus. You saw that on the introduction slide for this section. Zus is a young architecture firm from Holland, and I would urge you to take a look at them. They're very interesting. And they created a story that I'm going to tell you now, and that I think is a very good story to explain a situation of in-between, of gray zones, and potentially of weightlessness, or almost weightlessness.